Okay, so I'd like to go over just a couple of files that were turned in. Again, I'm going to say one more time that I'm not picking on you, so if I show your file, it's not the end of the world. It's, again, a lot of the same mistakes are occurring throughout this, so I just want to make sure everybody's good on this. So we're going to look at Michelle's first. Sorry, Michelle, you're always, it's just, you're used to it now, aren't you? Yeah, okay. At any rate, just a couple things that I wanted to talk about here, just in terms of the way you think about doing a few things, a couple of mistakes that I see, and ways to fix them is really the most important part about all this. So if we take a look at the initial part for Michelle's, she actually does her knockout. She's got a spill layer on here, but if we take a look at the spill layer by itself and without the mask, you can see that her entire background, which was green, has now become gray, and it almost looks like, I'm not even really sure how you got there, but that's not really the point. The point is that you can see that the spill that's been removed on the face is also gray. All of those are issues that we are having with this. If I turn the mask back on, you can also see, I'm going to go ahead and turn the white background as well. You can see then I've still got a little bit of spill of the green spill that's still in here. I've got a lot of gray spill removal that's in the hair, and I've also got a lot of gray spill removal that's in the face. And the thing about doing this spill removal work is that you don't need to accept the color that you have. You can actually go over it again and again and again. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Let me get my tablet going. Okay, so I'm going to actually work on this layer that's got the spill remove on it. I'm going to fix the spill that's actually on her face first. I'm going to change this gray to actually a skin tone color. So to do that, again, I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. I'm going to change the hardness of my brush to 0. Make sure that it is a color blending mode set for the brush. Again, I don't want to change the luminosity of this of the area that I'm working with. I just want to change the color. I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger. Come on. And that didn't get color, that got saturation. Brush a little bit larger here. 100% opacity in this. And I've actually got a pencil that is selected and not my brush. So I'm going to make sure it is the brush tool. Change the blending mode down to color. 100% opacity, 100% flow on this. And then I'm going to sample a color of her skin. Again, I'm going to make this brush a little bit bigger. Hold down the Option key to simply click and sample her skin. You can see my foreground color now is the color of that skin. And then I can come in here and I can actually change the color of her skin. Now, in my case, I feel like this puts in too much red. So we can change that by slowing down how much of an impact that we ultimately have on this. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. And I'm simply going to drop my flow in this down to around 14-15% here. And then I can start scrubbing in slowly like this, and it's actually a little bit more effective. I still think its flow is a little bit too fast. I just hit Command Z to undo that again, and drop this down to like 10%, 9%. And then again, I'm just scrubbing in here to actually bring color back into that. I've got to bring it back into her ear as well. I've definitely got to bring it in on the other side. And again, I'm changing color, not luminosity, so I don't need to worry about this area over here is more shadow than not. And so this is the way I would actually fix that. To fix the hair, I'm simply going to, again, hold down the Option key and click to get the color sampler. And you can see when you use this color sampler that you get this thing called a heads-up display. There's a circle with 2 colors on it, surrounded by this big gray circle. The lower half of it is the color that the brush was, the old color. The color on the top now is the new color. You can actually move this thing around and you'll see that the newer color at the top changes, and so you can really target where you want to pick this to actually come from. So I'm going to pick that color right there and say OK. And then again, I can simply come in here. I got a low flow on this. So I'm going to drag my flow all the way back up because it needs it here. And then I can just fix this part in here. Again, I think that color, there's too much red in there. It's actually hitting it too fast. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. And then another option is, instead of using flow to control this, we can simply drop our opacity down to 50%. 50% will actually marry the old color with the new color slightly, and so that part works. I'm going to resample another color over here, resample another color over here, resample another color over here. I'm going to stay away from her ear because I've got a really soft brush. If I want to come in and do this work very close to her ear, simply change your brush to a completely hard brush, and then you can really zoom in and fix the color that is the spill that's right next to it. You can see there's green spill in there as well. So again, I'll sample a color up here, and then I can come down and actually knock that part out and sample a color of her ear to fix that part that's right there, and on and on and on. So anyway, all I'm trying to point out is that you can change these colors after the fact. I also want to take a look at her layers palette. I'm going to expand this up a little bit just so that we have a chance to see it. So she starts out pretty good. Oh, before I actually look at this layers palette, hang on one second. I want to look at one other thing first. So I'm going to bring this back to what it looked like when she actually did it. I'm going to come down here just to look at her hair patch. So we're just going to take a quick peek at this. So again, I'm simply holding down the Option key, and you can see what's happening here. So this is, I'm just isolating this, and this is an important thing for you guys to do, is isolate your the layers that you're using to fix certain things, to take a look at it. And you can see that there's an enormous amount of transparency in here, and the problem with that is that even if this looks really good, so this is what the image looks like, this is what her hair fix looks like, and at first blush you think, well, yeah, that looks great. I mean, there's no problem with this. But the truth of the matter is that you have got, you have got all this transparency that's sitting in here, and what happens when you have transparency is that this is adding new texture right here. I probably wrote this in every single person who's in this room. I sent you in your review of this assignment about this whole transparency. We have got areas in here. I'm going to zoom way in here. You can see there's areas of transparency all throughout this. So what is transparent here is allowing texture from the original image to come through, and these two textures are mixing with one another, and when those two things mix, you destroy the texture. You don't have real texture anymore. A lot of times it looks good, but it isn't good. Does that make sense, everyone, what we're talking about here? We good on this part? You guys are already on spring break, aren't you? Which sucks, because today is probably the most intense day that we'll have in this class. Aren't you happy to hear that in the beginning? Yeah, I know. Everybody's thinking, fuck, this isn't intense enough already. Anyway. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. And then I want to take a quick look at the layers palette again. So what we've got going on here is, this was the original knockout done correctly, and then the hair fix is pixel work, and so she did that part right. So that part is actually done right as well. And this is something that a lot of people did not do that actually Michelle did that was actually really good, is that she then creates a new virgin. That's what this layer is right here. A lot of you guys ran into trouble when you did your split frequency work and you tried to put layer masks on this split frequency work. And the reason this becomes a problem is that it's not a problem for the high detail layer, it's a problem for the low detail layer. What happens, I'm going to go ahead and load this as a selection and apply it to this low layer right here. And I'm going to do the same thing to this one right here. The high layer selection hasn't been blurred at all, and that part's great. But in the low layer selection, what's actually happened here is that the image itself is blurred, and when those images blur, they actually spread and they come out underneath your mask. And so that's a problem. We're going to take a look at it later on, just so that I can show you guys how to fix this, how to avoid this. But in Michelle's case, she actually did the right thing. So I'm going to actually go back and undo both of those. She did the right thing by creating a new virgin right here. So this would be her new virgin right here. So this is where she starts here for her split. So again, She's done the hair fix part on it. She's done the spill removal. She's got a new color background. She's got all of that part going. And then she does her split, and she doesn't need to worry about that anymore. So the split frequency work now is still pixel work. So her layer order here was correct. She did not, and most people, I think maybe only one person in this class actually set up to have copies of yours of the split frequency work so that you were able to go back after the fact if you needed to. Remember, if you want to be able to edit this after the fact, before you do any work on this, so let's imagine Michelle has just done the split. You select the low layer here and just Command J to copy it. That's all you need to do. And then all the work that you do is on this low copy layer. The virgin of it is the original low copy. So if something screws up on the low copy, you've got the original low that you can actually steal that pixel content or that pixel information from and fix your screw up. And again, the important part about this is that not necessarily the day you're working on this. It's 6 months later when you go back in to refine this thing. That's when this starts to become a problem. Does that make sense? Because nobody's going to remember how much blur they put on this image. There's no way to recreate this after the fact, is what I'm trying to say. Conceivably, you could put notes into your naming so that you did know, but anyway, blah, blah, and nobody does that. So for the high detail layer, again, Command J to do a copy of it. However, when that happens, your image, well, here, let's turn it on so you can actually see it. Let me go back in time before we did that part. Turn this on. Make sure that this is the only guy that's on. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here so you can see what happens. I'm going to now copy the high layer, and when you do that, you'll see that you pick up an enormous amount of contrast. That image just got really, really, really sharp. So it's not the same as our original image was. You need to change this so that it actually does what you want it to do, so that it becomes the place for you to actually work. So to do that, you have to do two things. The first thing is you change the blending mode of this upper layer from linear light back to normal. And you'll see that it becomes gray, and then you clip this to the layer that's actually underneath it. To do the clipping, you actually hold your cursor in between both of those layers, hold down the Option key, you'll get the little square with the down arrow, click on it, it's now clipped that down to this lower, and now this is the layer you would actually work on, and the high detail version is sitting right underneath it in case you get into trouble. So far this was going well, except for, again, doing the safety there, the protective part there. She then does another merge here, and I'm not entirely sure why this merge exists. Again, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, but she does another merge stamp version. So all the pixel work that she does, she bakes this into a layer, and that's maybe the problem that I have with it. So that if she wanted to go back and continue to do some high and low split frequency work, this layer that's up on top prevents her from being able to do that, because this thing is now what you see. Does that make sense to everybody? Then she actually duplicates that again and does a little bit more pixel work. And you can see here, if we turn this on and off, it's sort of lightening a little bit around the skin, that kind of stuff. But the problem I have with all of this is that all of this pixel work, for the most part, could be done in the split frequency part. But now, because she's actually merged all of this, baked this into these layers up on top, there's no way to go back and continue to do this pixel work unless we throw away these pixel layers that are on top. These are all dead to us now, as is everything else under it. The spill removal is dead to us. The knockout is dead to us. All of that is because it's all been baked into where we are now, heading on up. Now, you don't need to do that. Again, all that pixel work can be done here. However, her tonal layers are now in a really good spot to be able to do that work on top of it. So this part's working out fine. However, then she goes back into pixel work here. So when she does her eyes and veins, contact removal, the eyebrows, when she does work on the eyebrows, all of this kind of stuff, this again, she had to bake all of the tonal work into these layers in order to continue to do this work. She would have been much better off to actually gone back down and done this down here where the split frequency work is, either in these split frequency work layers, or you do one merge of this. Again, she doesn't need this layer number 2. She's got one already there called pixel. She brings it all down, and all of this work, all the eye vein, all the eyebrows, all of this stuff, it all could be done on this pixel layer right down here. And then she doesn't have to worry about baking the tonal layers into new pixel layers as we work our way up. Is this making sense to everyone? Who did I lose here? Good on this part? So again, in the end, she gets there, but there is the idea of being able to go back in space, to be able to go back in time and refine these. Again, one of the things I tell everybody to do when you're retouching is spend your day working on it, stop at the end of the day, pour a large glass of wine, watch some TV, get away from this, revisit this the next day or the day after, put fresh eyes on it, and you'll be shocked at the things that you'll see that you missed when you were actually doing the work. So you need to have this flexibility to continue to go back. Are we good on this part? All right, close that guy up. So I'm going to show you Mitchell's. And Mitchell, I graded your one called version 2 because that looked like the cleanest one. Is that the one that you really wanted me to grade? Okay. Actually, I'm going to go look at version 1 because that's, well, here, I'll take it back. I won't look at that. I'll show where this actually went wrong. So this happened to a lot of people. You see this really weird edge thing that you get right here. This is exactly what I was talking about when you actually have a situation where you have tried to actually do your split frequency work. I'm going to open up his split frequency layer right here. Now you can see in the case of Mitchell, what he did is that he actually applied the layer mask to this to actually draw it out. He actually does protective layers though, so he was one of the people that actually did that. But you can see if we take a look just at this, when he actually does the layer mask on here, he ran into this problem with the first version that he did of this, and he was trying to actually get this part to fix. But again, so he's actually got his low copy has also had that the layer mask has been applied. All of that's going on in here, and instead what he should have done, so you can see if we come down to here to his knockout, again, let me turn this on, go back to the way you had it originally, turn everybody else off, turn this on. So he gets to this stage of the game, this is his initial knockout, and this part actually works out really well. But then what he goes to do, he makes these things, and again, he's trying to keep the image, you can see right here, he's trying to keep the image splittable and keep that white background. So he actually removes it. But again, it's this soft edge that screws everything up when you actually try to do that. So the better way to actually go about doing this, you realize that he ultimately fixes this. He puts his split work into a group, and then he actually adds a layer mask to this group, and then he goes in and he actually paints on this layer mask to actually try to get rid of that problem. So this is what it looks like without it. This is that horrible line part that you get around it. So the easier method of doing all of this, if this was where I was at and I was hell-bent and determined on keeping this split layer like this, to actually go ahead and do this, I would get rid of this layer mask. I'm simply going to delete it. So I'll just show you how I would do the split. And I'm going to click on all of these and get rid of all of this. I'm just going to get rid of all his work right here. Okay, so this is where we're at. So here are your two options. So your first option is, again, I don't have a layer mask on this guy. I have removed the spill, so we can load his zero selective color, and hopefully that's actually good. So it'll be a layer mask right here. And go ahead and invert it. So this actually looks good. He's ready to go on this. However, he wants to split this, and you can't, it does not work to keep these layer masks in the split. So I'm going to get rid of this. I'm not going to apply it. I'm simply going to delete it. Then I'm going to do my split frequency here. I'm going to make 2 copies of this. So again, Command J, Command J. I'm going to call this low. I'm going to call this high. I'm going to turn off this. I'm going to go back to my low. I'm going to blur it. Let's say we'll blur it. Again, I'm just going through the motions here, guys. I'm going to hit it with 4, fine. I'm going to go up to my high layer here and do the same thing. Again, the rest of the split work. So up to image, down to apply image, pick the low layer. Go ahead and subtract this. Scale of 2 and offset. I'm not going to put in my safety layers here just for speed purposes. Change the blending mode to linear light. And so this part works out really well. However, I need to apply the layer mask, and I can't apply it to both of these layers because, again, you'll get that weird halo part around it. So instead, select both of these, your split work. We're going to put it into its own group. Call it split. And say OK, and then load the layer mask again and put it on the group. So I'm going to put it up here on the group instead, and then you don't run into that problem. And again, I'll invert this, and you'll see I've now got my split work, but I don't have that sick halo that's actually in here. Did that make sense to everybody, what's going on? So those are your 2 options. Go ahead and combine this to make a new version, combine it with the white background, or keep those layers separate, put it into a group, and then have the entire group masked by that layer mask. So that would be the other option to get around that part. I'm going to show Lucas's really quick. So in this case, my guess is what's happened in here, and you can see is that it sort of has some texture in it. It's losing some texture in certain areas. There's a certain repeatable texture in this. So I'm feeling like in a certain way, some things I know are original, some things I'm not really sure about this, but it simply looks overdone. It's an unreal natural skin tone. But the real culprit in this, I don't think is the high layer. I think it's the low layer. And to see what I mean, we're going to open up the split so you can actually see it. I'm going to take the low layer and I'm simply going to drop the opacity of this down to about 50%. And you'll see it starts to return some of those contours, the original contour, to the face. So I'm going to do a snapshot here of what this guy looks like so we can go back and forth between the 2. So this is where it was and this is where it is right now. So I just think it was an overdone way to actually smooth out the tones that are here in the low layer. That could happen using a mixer brush. There's some people when they do low frequency work, they simply will go in and blur this. I'll show you what that looks like or why they would actually do that. So hang on 1 second. Let me duplicate this and rasterize it. So this is, let's just pretend that this is our low layer right here. So we'll go ahead and actually do a Gaussian blur on it. I'm going to do that same 4 Gaussian blur. And then once this is split, so we're going to call this, pretend that this is the low layer. People will take the lasso tool and let's say, for instance, they want to smooth out this area that's underneath her eye. They will actually take this lasso tool and they will bring this lasso point around this part. And then they'll simply blur this again. So if you come up and you do Gaussian blur again, sorry, let's undo that. Let me control the Gaussian blur. So blur, Gaussian blur, and then really smack this hard. You can see that that gets rid of that. It's starting to get rid of that tone that's actually underneath her skin right there. So let me kick it back. It's a little too hot in there. And I'll go ahead and say OK to this. And then people just do that all over the image. They'll come over into this area over in here, and they'll do the same thing over here. They'll simply blur this guy. And you can see it smooths all of the skin out. It smooths that sort of like color and tone out. But ultimately, the result is something that looks like that. I want to show Ben's really quick. Same problem, doing the split frequency work. So here, again, we've got that same edge line problem that's actually happening here, because again, if we take a look at his split frequency work here, you can see it's the same thing. He's got these individual layer masks that are actually sitting on that. So another option that you have, instead of getting rid of all the layer masks and then adding a layer mask up here on the top, what we can do is this. You can actually realize is that the only thing you really need to keep out of your split frequency work is the retouching itself. So to see the retouching itself, I'm going to turn his split layers on and off. You can see there's considerable work there. What I'm going to do instead, to get rid of this halo problem, there's no retouching that's happened around the edge of this. So I don't need to keep those areas at all. So instead, I'm going to put a black layer mask on his entire frequency separation layer. It's holding down the Option key and click on Add Layer Mask to the whole thing. That gets rid of all his retouching. It doesn't get rid of it. It hides all of it. Then I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush, make it relatively large. Take the opacity all the way up, the flows all the way up. It's a normal brush. I'll make sure it's a medium hard brush because I don't want to overspray too much. Hit the D key to default my foreground and background colors to black and white. White is now my foreground color. So now I can simply paint in all of this area around here that does all, it reveals all the split frequency work that he did, but I'm not coming over here to the edge where that halo comes in. You'll see if I do, you bring the halo in. That's not what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to continue to, let me back out a little bit, to simply go over this whole thing to bring back in or to reveal all the split frequency work that he actually did. And then I'm actually good to go. I would take a look at this. You'll see if I hold down the Option key and take a look at it, you can see all the holes that are in the reveal mask, whatever, that we'd actually need to fill in. And I don't have anything that's going on this side over here, but that's actually how. So now this is how my split frequency works, and I would hide the halo. Make sense? Alrighty. With that being said, we need to talk today. We're getting into compositing. So most of you, anybody in this room have Capture One licensed on your computer? So you're just going to have to watch this. I'm going to show it to you in Capture One. You can do different versions of this in different software. So you'll just basically get the idea of what I'm sort of going for here. I just want to show you how I actually go about setting up and shooting composites and the way in which we do this. So right now would be a really good time to take out a piece of paper so that you can actually write this down. If you'll start me a sign-in sheet, that'd be great. Make sure you get on the sign-in sheet. So when we're doing compositing, the challenge that we're going to have in all of this, and the thing that we are going to deal with all day today, is how do you take two separate images and bring them together in a convincing enough way that they're seen as a single image, that they are a believable composite. That's going to be the big challenge that we've actually got today. So we need to take a lot of things into consideration when we actually shoot our images for compositing in order to get them to work. Does that make sense, everybody? So when we think about the kind of things that we would need to put together, or the things that we would need to have be the same, what things of these two images would have to match in order for it to appear like they were shot at the same time? So I'll give you a hint to begin with. Exposure. If you've got, let's say, and I'm just going to use this this is an example because this is the one we're actually looking at. I've got my background, the background that I'm actually using are some pictures that were done in the woods, and the subject that I want to actually put them into is shot in the studio. So those are my two extremes, right? So I'm just going to refer to them that way. But composites can be anything. Composites can be, you can actually, knock food out and put it on the kitchen table. You can actually, knock, your dog out and get him to be flying off the top of Mount Everest. I mean, the sky's the limit here in terms of what you do. So, but I'm just talking about this figure-ground relationship, right? So exposure has to be the same for them both, or they're just not believable. If you've got a really light background and a really dark subject, there's nothing that would explain that, and it doesn't look, they don't fit together. Does that make sense? So other things, color. If the color is radically different between the two, not even radically different, if it's partially different between the two, you will also run into a problem. Perspective. perspective is a really tough one, but we're going to look at perspective in great length today. Scale is another one. It's a huge one that people don't, when you look at it, especially perspective and scale, are two things that can cause your composite to look fake, and you maybe won't even realize why that actually is. But scale is a huge thing. We instinctively know the scale of many, many things. So for instance, how tall is a car? Typical car. Well, think about it. Everybody stand up really quick. So can you put your hands on the top of a car? So it's about there, right? Wouldn't that seem about it? That feels about right. You know, it's not down here, right? Not unless it's like a really expensive Italian race car. But so it sort of feels like about here. It's not up here unless it's like a giant truck, right? So this gives you some, you know, so you say to yourself, well, okay, I'm 5'10", so a car, top of a car is about 5 feet tall. We instinctively know that, right? You can sit down. All of those things, when you see then somebody standing next to a car, if all of a sudden the person is double the size of the car, that is a scale mismatch, right? Or if a person is actually shorter, if a full-grown adult is standing next to a car and they only come up to the door handle, that is a scale mismatch. Does this all make sense to you guys? So scale is another thing. Focus and depth of field are also an issue here. If you shoot a landscape and you do not actually set the focus where your figure is supposed to be, and it focuses at infinity or it focuses 20 feet beyond, all of a sudden you're trying to put a figure that is in focus into a spot in your background that is not in focus. So depth of field and focus also are issues here that have to match. Does that make sense to everyone? So all of these things we need to take into consideration. The final two on this, when we talk about doing color, color involves multiple things. Color involves not only the hues that we're dealing with, but also the level of saturation. So if, for instance, you have an extremely saturated background and your figure that you're putting into it is very desaturated, again, you have a mismatch. You've got and all of these things will cause your composite to look fake. So all of these things are the things that we are going to try to actually tackle today to actually fix. The first thing that I'm going to do, though, is talk about how you can actually, the best way that you can actually set up to get your figures to actually function in your background. So the first thing that we have to decide here is order. What do you shoot first, the figure or the landscape? Anyone? You shoot the landscapes first. Why? You can't relight a landscape. So if I do out in the woods, I'm going to go out in the woods. I'm here. I'll show you the picture that I'm actually start with. This is the picture that I'm actually going to start with. This is my shot in the woods. We are going to actually bring this into Photoshop together and work on this. So, but I'm just saying this is basically where I start in the woods. It gives me a number of things. And the number one thing, number of things. First off, I've got my scenery, my background here, but again, the reason you shoot your backgrounds first is that you cannot change the lighting of your background. You can change the lighting in the studio to match it, right? Imagine I can go into the studio and I can try to recreate this lighting. That's not going to be a challenge. But let's say you started off in the studio and you had a really strong side light, and then you got to decide, okay, well, I'm going to now go out and shoot the landscape that I'm going to put this in. You have got to go looking for landscapes that have a really strong side light that are lit on them. Does that make sense, everyone, what I'm talking about? And it's not impossible to do, but you cannot believe how long and how much time that will eat up when you actually try to do the shooting. Because you find the perfect background and then you say to yourself, oh my God, it's the wrong time of day. I got to come back here and change a different time of day. Those changes are easier to make in the studio using lighting. Trying to actually get the day that's got the right amount of contrast, the direction of the light is the light that you want, all of those kind of things to match is an absolute time kill. You will actually spend days trying to get one landscape that you can actually put your figures in. Whereas if you do it the other way around, you can shoot a whole day of backgrounds and go into the studio and just adjust your lighting as you're trying to actually get your figures to match the lighting of your scene. Are we good on that part? So do not do it the other way around. I've watched people do this and then spend months trying to get backgrounds to actually put their figures into. It's horrible. Get the background part first. The second thing that I've got going here is that, so now I've got my background, I can actually go into the studio and I can mimic what's happening in my background. That's going to be the next thing. Well, I'm going to talk about a couple other things first, and then we'll get to that. The next thing that I've got going here is that she's actually holding a color card, and that gives me two things. That number one, it gives me exposure, because again, I base my exposure on the white patch here. I set that white patch between 245 and 250. If I do that on my figure in the scenery, and then I do the same thing in the studio, those two will have the same exposure. If I color balance using this color card, my scene, and then also use the color card in the studio and color balance, they will be the same color when I put them together. So they have the same exposure, the same color. Now, the trick to this is that you always want, when you put these things together, for them to be the same. You can then take your composite and make your composite much bluer, much warmer, much colder, much less saturated. You can do all of those things to it, but you want to do those once the composite is put together. You don't want to do them separately. You don't want to take a really cool figure and put it into a really warm background and then try to match the two and then make does that make sense where we're going with all here? So again, having this card in here common to both of those scenes gives me common color, common exposure. So then I can actually go in, once the composite is made, I can make the whole thing darker, the whole thing lighter, the whole thing warmer, the whole thing colder, the whole thing, whatever I want to make it. Because they're already integrated, they're already the same. Are we good on that part? The other two things that I've got here with the figure in here is I've got scale, because I've got a figure in here that I can match, and I've also got a focus point in here. So I know I can actually focus onto this figure. So when you're shooting your backgrounds, you actually do want to get a figure in there if you can get it. If you're adding figures, anything that you can get that's close to what you're actually trying to add, you want to have those elements in your background to give you a reference point. Does this make sense, everyone? So if you take a look at the little rocks that are actually she's standing on right now, that's what I start with here in this. And then immediately, I've got a frame where she's not in it. So I simply shoot one that gives me all that information. I shoot another version of this that doesn't have her in it so that I've got a clean background to work with, and I'm off to the races. But the other thing that I've got going on here by shooting the background first is that I can look at the landscape. So if you look at the rocks where she's actually standing, I went into the studio to actually match this, and I recreated the rocks using sandbags, and that's what's going on right here. If you take a look at this, the sandbags here were set up to recreate the rocks so that her feet were oriented at the same level, so that they were at the same angle, all of that kind of stuff. It gave me that option to do. In Capture One, you can use an overlay tool to do this, and this is the overlay tool right here. To actually use the overlay tool, you grab your real background and you simply drag it on top of the overlay tool, and it will actually put it in place. Then you select your image. This is the image that I'm actually going here. With the overlay controls, we can control opacity of this. So I can actually see, the sort of the image that I'm shooting in the studio relative to the image that's in the background. You can actually, I'm going to zoom into the area that is just the rocks. And you can sort of see what I'm trying to actually do here. So this is actually going back and forth to sort of get that idea. And you can sort of see my sandbags right along here are matching the edges of the rocks right here. So you can actually move, when you've got your overlay set, you can use this control to move them around a little bit. So it's just, it's just a way to actually control this part so that you can actually say, okay, this is now, I've actually created a situation in my studio that mimics the thing that I've got going on in real life. Does this make sense, everyone? So other things that you can actually do, if you've got somebody leaning against something, again, lean them against something like this. Get this in the studio. If I've got something that's in my background that allows me to do this, and I can get my figure to get into that shape, then when I put the composite together, it's a lot more convincing. Does that make sense? I need everybody to look back here really quick. These are just tricks to think about when you're actually shooting your both your landscapes and your figures. So this is my landscape right here. This is just an element of my landscape. It's a tree, it's a car, it's I don't know what, it's a building. It doesn't matter what it is. I'm the composite and you throw me into this thing. What happens is that I am now sitting on top of this background. And that's the way things would happen in a normal composite anyway. But if you want to add greater believability to this, you take something in your background and you actually stack it in front of your figure. And it will be much more convincing. What do I mean by that? This is far more convincing. I've now got an element that's in my background that's actually in front of part of my figure. My arm is being hidden by this. It will psychologically anchor them into that space. So I'm always looking for things that I can actually do. You have people standing on grass all the time. Have some of the grass come up over the top of their shoes. Not over the top, but over, you know, where your heels are in the shoes. Anything that you can get that's in your background that you can bring in front of your figure will anchor them in space and create a greater sense of believability. Are we good on this part? Makes sense? So anyway, that's what I do with this. Some people do not have access to Capture One. You can do this old school. We used to do this when we would shoot film. Simply take a piece of vellum or tracing paper, put it on your screen. You can actually draw your little figure out on your background. Change the image. So here, I would do this. I put up this image. I put, this is on my computer screen. Take the thinnest piece of vellum that you can actually get and just trace out where the rocks are. You'll be able to see it. And then put your figure on the same thing and you will be able to see where your figures are. And you can then, again, do the sandbag trick or the whatever trick you're actually using. Does this make sense, everyone, what's going on here? No? Yes? Questions about this? Okay. So you guys can do this with me. So if you can go to our Session 9 files in your student file folder, there is a thing called Tree Exercise. And if you open that guy up, let me find the ones that I'm looking for really quickly here first. Yeah, we're going to do the trees first. So if you can, inside the folder that says, everybody find the tree exercise folder? Okay, inside that there is two files. They're raw files. One's called Trees 013. The other one's called Trees 019. If you can simply hold down your Command key to click on the second one, so you don't need to worry about the XMP files in there. If you select them, it won't matter. But again, just open up both of these into Photoshop. They will both open up in Capture One. I'm sorry, in Camera Raw. So inside of Camera Raw, we've done this before. What I need to do is I need to check on exposure for this. I also need to actually use the card to match color on the figure to my other image that's over here. So my first move is to simply hold down the spacebar and Command to get the zoom tool. I'm going to zoom in onto the color card. The first move I'm going to make is color balance. So again, it's the white balance tool that's all the way in the palette that's to the right. Simply click on the little eyedropper, come over, and I'm going to click on the gray that is actually right next to the red. That will actually do the white balance for this. Then I'm going to hover over the white patch and actually see what my readout is. And you can see I've got a readout that's up in my histogram right here, and it's reading 248, 247, 245. That's telling me that the exposure in this is correct. Again, that is in the range that I want it to be, that 245 to 250. Everybody remember this part, right? So the exposure part of this is correct. The color part of this has been neutralized. Now I need to apply those very same things to this other image that's over here, the one that does not have the figure in it. To do that, you hover over the, I've got my thumbnails that run up along the left side. Your thumbnails may be running along the bottom. It doesn't matter. It's in the very same place. If you hover over the top right edge of the thumbnail, you'll get a little a menu will appear, and you click on the little three dots, and you do a select all. It will actually put a thinner gray line around the second image, and then go right back to that very same little three dot menu, click on it again, and come down to Sync Settings. And a dialog box will open up and it will say, okay, well, this is the defaults. There's a drop-down menu that you can use to actually pick which settings you want to go ahead and sync. In this case, if you're not sure if default will cover it, simply pick all. The only things that we've done in here is done a white balance. That's all that we've actually done, and simply hit OK. That is now applied the white balance. So now the color and exposure on this bottom one are identical to the one that's on the top, and I'm good to go. I do want to open both of these. So again, I'm going to hold down, in my case, I'm going to go ahead and change these so that everybody opens as a smart object. So again, I simply clicked on the hyperlink that's at the very bottom to change this to open as object. It will say open as objects plural because these are both selected, and we do want that to happen. We want both of these to actually open. I need both of these to work on this image. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, yep, fine, open these as objects. So I'm simply going to click on open as objects, and both of them will open up in Photoshop. Now again, this is one of the reasons that I like not having stuff open as tabs in here. I've got two separate images. If you had yours open as tabs, tear them apart so that you can see both of these separately from one another. And then what I ultimately need to do in here is that I need to actually use I need to use both of these at the same time. So to do that, I'm going to select the one that's got the figure in it, and I'm going to drag it on top of the one that does not have the figure in it. Now, you can't drag the image file itself. You actually drag the layer. So I'm going to come over to my layers palette. Again, the figure is the one that's on the top, so that's what is showing in my layers palette. Click and drag it over to on top of the image that does not have the figure in it. But before you let go, hold down the Shift key and it will actually center the two on top of one another. Now in this case, there's a slight mismatch because I was actually hand holding this when I shot it, but I'm not that concerned about that. All I'm really concerned about is using the one that has the layer that has the figure in it to give me a scale when I bring in the figure that I'm actually going to put into this space. So at this stage of the game, I can get rid of the lone figure, the one that only has the single layer of the figure in it. I can simply close that up. You do not need to save that. And now basically I've got an image that has two layers in it. The layer on the bottom is the layer that I'm actually going to go with. The layer that's on the top has actually got my reference material in it. Is everybody good on this far? Yes.
How did you drag it over?
Simply grab the layer that's got the figure in it and drag it on top of the image that does not. And hold down your Shift key. It will center it. And then get rid of the one that only has the figure in it. It's housekeeping. We good on this part? All right, we're gonna do the same thing with another image. So in the other image, if you come back to the tree exercise folder, there are two images that were now shot in the studio. One of them has, they're the ones that are on green screen. And if you look at the little thumbnails, you'll spot them both. It's the ENG 102706_B, whatever. It's those two. So again, there's two of them in here. So I'm going to hold down the Command key to select those two. So it's frame number 0001 and frame number 0047. Those are the two that you want to open. So again, I'm just going to open them both. They will both open up in Camera Raw. And I'm going to do the exact same trick here. I'm going to, again, work on the image that's actually got the color card in it. I'm going to zoom into the color card. In this case, I'm going to color balance this again. So I'm going to click on my white balance tool, the eyedropper. I'm going to click on the very same color gray. So now the color of the trees and the color of this green screen image are identical. Make sense? I'm going to check. I'm hovering over the exposure part right here, and you can see that I'm reading in the 50s, the 252, that kind of stuff, whatever. But there's glare on this card. So actually, it's a bad card. I can use other tricks to determine if this exposure is correct. We have talked about the red channel on Caucasian skin in this class, have we not? Okay, so if I actually hover over the red channel of her nose, again, I'm looking for Caucasian highlight. The red channel is reading 245. That is the threshold of this. That is the top end. Typically, I want my R value to read between 225 and 245. I'm at the 245 mark. So this is pretty maxed out. It's up at the top. And so this again is indicating my exposure, and this is going to be extremely close. So that's where I'm going to go after this guy. Makes sense, everyone? Okay, so again, I'm going to do the same trick. I now need to apply any of those adjustments that I've made to the image that does not have the card in it, the one that I want to actually use. So I'm going to, again, hover over the top of the thumbnail in the top right-hand corner, click on the little 3 dots, come down to Select All, go right back to the same spot, come down and say Sync Settings. Again, the default includes the basic panel, which is the only thing I've actually touched, so I know I'm okay here. I'm simply going to say OK. So now the color balance has been applied to the image that does not have the color card in it. Now this is the only image I need. I don't need to bring in the color card on this one. Any information that I need on that has already been applied to the figure just by itself. So that's where I'm going to go. So I'm going to open this as an object as well. Just the single image. I'm going to hide everybody else. I don't know why my screen does this. URLs shouldn't be doing this. But if you get a whole bunch of, like I can still see, this is still showing me my Finder window behind here. Even though I'm in Photoshop, you can see I'm actually in Photoshop. So if this happens to you, simply come up to the Photoshop menu, drop down, and come down to Hide Others, and it will get rid of all the others, and we can actually do what we need to do here. So with that done, I'm actually then again, because I've got both of these images that I can see, I'm going to make my image on the green screen, my top image. This is the one, it's selected, it's the active one. You can see I've got the layer that's got the green screen in it. And I'm simply going to click on that layer and drag it on top of my tree set and hold down the Shift key and let go, and it will bring it in centered. And then I can get rid of the image that I've actually got. So the image is on the green screen, the lone image. I don't need to save that anymore. So now I've got my layers stacked on exactly the way I ultimately want this to be. And now I can actually use these things to match scale and to also try to actually get my figure anchored onto the background. Is everybody good on this far? The problem that I've got with this, though, is that I need to actually knock this figure out, and I don't want to take the time to do that. So we already have a knockout made for you. So if you go back in, this is like the cooking shows where they put the turkey into the oven and then they whip out, and they go to the other oven and whip out the turkey that's been cooking for 4 hours. We're doing that kind of move right here. So go back and look in the tree exercise, and you will actually see that there is a Photoshop file that's actually, it's that same thing that's got knockout written in it. You'll see it's actually on a white background. If you simply double click that, it will open up this image that's actually been knocked out into Photoshop. Again, because it's not Photoshop, I don't know, there's something wrong with my computer, is not hiding everybody else. I'm going to simply click on Hide Others. Yes? If you look in your tree exercise folder, you don't have this ENG1227, no, the one on white? That's okay. So I'm going to go back to my tree stack right here, and I'm simply going to throw this folder away. Throw the layer away that actually shows the green screen, so that I can replace it with the one that's already been knocked out. So again, I just got rid of the one that we had just pulled in. I just want to make sure you understood how I was doing color balancing and all of that kind of stuff to get them to match. I'm now going to drag the layer that does have the knockout on it. Again, it's the top layer, and the reason you see it on this transparency is because I have the eyeball turned off for the layer that's underneath it. And I'm going to grab the layer and drag it on top of the trees. And again, before you let go, hold down the Shift key and it will actually center this. And then I'm going to close up the one, again, the image that just had the single knockout on it. So now I should have 3 layers here. You should have 3 layers. It should be the only image that you have open. You should have the very bottom one is just the background layer, the trees that I'm working in. The one in the middle is actually the figure of the girl who's also in the trees, and then I've got the knocked out version that's here that was actually done in the green screen in the studio. So now I can actually change this to actually fix this to work out. The first thing I'm going to do is zoom in slightly, is to scale the image of the girl that's in the studio, the green screen. I just need to make sure that I can move her, that she's scaled about the same size as the girl that's in the woods. So again, I'm going to hit the V key to get the move tool, and I'm actually going to move, move the girl who is actually on the green screen up so that she's a little bit taller. Yes, shoot.
The green knockout, it was two. I have one that just has a single, and then I had the one that has the knockout. I think I put the wrong one in.
That's okay.
Is this the correct one? Or
That is the, nope, here, go back to your trees, throw that one away.
Okay.
Perfect, go to this guy, click on that one. Drag him on top of that and hold down your shift key before you let go. And you can close this one up.
Okay.
And you're good to go. Okay, I need to scale this now. Now scaling gets to be a tricky thing. First, we'll just try it here. Make sure that you do have the green screen girl selected. Hit Command T, that is the transform dialog box. And what we don't see here are the handles. And the reason you don't see any of the corner control handles is because they're actually outside of our image. You can't see them right now. So I am going to come up to the options menu that's at the very top, the bar that's at the very top, and you'll see on the far right hand side there's a check mark and a circle with a line through it. The check marks will, if you've done a transform, it'll go ahead and commit the transform. The circle is a way to get out of it, to actually get out of the transform dialog box without doing anything. So click on the circle. If you want to see the handles, we've got to go to the pasteboard. So again, hit the F key to get to it. And now, when you actually hit Command T, you'll actually see you do have control handles that are around it. Now, we do not necessarily need the control handles, but you've got them there in case you need them. Just so, again, the pasteboard will actually show that to you, whereas the regular workspace that we've got will not. However, does everybody have this little crosshair in the middle of their image? If you do not, it's this check mark. Look right under the word that says Photoshop up at the top. There's a little place there for a check mark. If that is not checked, your little crosshair will not show up. You do need this to show up for all the perspective work that we're going to do today. You've got to leave this on. It should be on by default. At any rate, what happens with this is that your image will actually transform around this crosshair wherever it actually is. So I'm not going to use the control handles to do this. I'm actually going to simply use the scales that are up on my options bar. So again, up at the very top, you'll see where there it says, as you work your way over there, you hit a W. The W stands for width, and it's at 100%. And then right next to it is an H. That stands for height, also at 100%. If you click on the link between the two, you actually lock them in relationship to one another, which is what we want to do. When we transform this, we want it to scale proportionately. You don't want to change the height and not change the width. The girl would then get distorted if you actually do that. So I click on that link to do that. And then instead of actually having to use the control handles, I hover over either the H or the W, and I get the Scrubby Slider. And I can click, and if I drag to the left, my image gets smaller. And if I click to the right, it gets larger. But what you'll see is it does all of that around this focus point that's right above her crotch. So what happens is that it pulls her head down, but it also lifts her feet up. Now, you can eventually get these two to match, but it ends up taking so much longer. There's a trick to actually using this crosshair to avoid that problem. So again, I'm going to click on the little circle up at the top that'll actually undo any transforming that I've done. It simply goes away. I'm going to hit Command T again, but before I do the transform now, I'm actually going to drag this control point. Now, I've moved this girl so that her shoes are the same place as the other girl's shoes in the woods in the back. Then I'm going to take this crosshair point and I'm going to drop it right down here on their shoes. So now what happens when I do my transform is it will only transform her head down. Her feet will not move. And it's just a quicker, faster way of doing it. So I'm still going to click on the link between my width and my height, and then come over and hover over either the W or the H, it doesn't matter which one, and click and make the girl a little bit smaller. And you can see her foot is not moving, but now I can actually gauge her size in relationship to the girl that's actually in the woods, that's right behind her. Now I'm going to make her slightly taller than the girl that's in the woods for two reasons. Number one is I'm married to the girl in the woods and I know how tall she is, and I shot the girl in the studio and I know how tall she is. And the girl in the woods is 5'8", and the girl in the studio is 5'10", and the girl in the studio is wearing heels. So she has got to be a little bit taller than the girl that's actually in the woods. And I would say by 2 or 3 inches. Does this look like she's 2 or 3 inches taller? We're close enough, right? So in my case, I ended up scaling her at 96%. If you want the exact same one that I've got, you're good to go. And again, then I'm simply going to click on the check mark. And she is now scaled in the woods correctly to the woods. And this part matters. This is what I was telling you guys before. You may not instinctively know how big the rocks are, the trees are, whatever, but do you know how big leaves are? And if this girl, so for instance, let's do not do this. I'm just going to scale her radically different than this. If this is how your composite began to look, I would tell you that she has to be in the redwoods with like gigantic trees and monster boulders, that kind of stuff. You look at this and you know this is wrong. Because even though the boulders there might be boulders that big and there might be trees that big, there are not leaves that are that big. Right? So again, I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that to bring her back. Turn on the girl that's on the back part right here. So she is now scaled at the correct size. The girl who's in the woods now has done all her work. We do not need her anymore. She's given us scale. She's given us placement. She also gave us originally a way to build the sandbags for the girl that's on the background. So at any rate, I'm going to throw the girl who's in the woods away. We don't need it anymore. She's done all her work. So now all I need to do is actually move this girl around so that she actually matches where the other girl was, where the rocks really were. Now I know the reference to this, so I'm simply going to hit the V key to get the move tool, and I'm going to move her slightly up. And the way this was actually designed to do is her lower heel is supposed to hit right at the edge of this one top rock. Do not worry about her other foot over there. That part doesn't really matter. And this is now actually the beginning of my composite. Are there questions about this so far? Okay. She looks like she's just floating there. Part of the reason she looks like she's just floating there is this image needs to be choked. She's got that green line that's around her. We're not going to bother getting into choking today. We've already gone through that twice in this class. If you have questions about that and you don't understand that part, either go back to look at the videos or send me an email. There's also a whole PDF that's in the session where we actually did chokes and spread about how to do it. So again, if you don't know, I'm not leaving you out in the woods. Ha ha ha. Thank you. Okay, I've now lost my whole train of thought just with the bad joke, right? I am not going to strand you out there, but again, you should know this stuff by now. And if not, there are resources. If you can't find them, let me know, and I'll make sure that you get them. So the biggest issue that we've got here is that, again, the reason that she looks like she's simply floating in space is that because there are no shadows. Shadows are what anchor your figures into space, and that's why this does not look anchored into space. So we're going to put in shadows. I'm going to show you simple shadows today. It's going to be very quick the way I actually show you to do it. I'm going to show you 2 ways to do it today. One of them is I use all the time. One of them I don't do anymore. If you are a really good artist, if you are somebody who paints and draws and you know all that kind of stuff, whatever, you understand that, then hand paint them. There's a lot of people who do. I'm not that good, so it doesn't work for me. But I'm going to show you my failed bad attempt at doing it. So the failed bad attempt at doing it. Your shadows, you want your shadows to be on top of your background but underneath your figure. And the reason that is that, again, your figure is casting shadow onto the background. So there would never be a shadow from the figure on top of herself. So your shadows always go on layers in between the two. So click on the tree layer at the very bottom, and then we're simply going to add a blank layer on the top. So I'm simply clicked on the little icon right next to the garbage can at the bottom of the layers palette. It puts a blank layer on the top, and we are good to go. Now in this case, I am going to go to my tablet. If you've got your tablet, great. If not, you can actually, I'll give you time to actually get your tablet. They're easier to just do if you've got a tablet to work with. Everybody good? Okay, so I am going to hit the D key to just simply default my foreground and background colors to black and white. Again, my shadows, I'm going to paint them with black and then probably use opacity to open them up a little bit because shadows typically are not jet black. So at any rate, so I'm going to zoom into her feet. I'm going to start with the one that's actually on the rock. It'll be a little bit easier one for me to actually work with. Now, it looks to me like part of this image, well, I'm just going to leave it here. We'll actually work with it. It's fine where it is right now. So, to actually paint the shadows, hit the B key to get a brush. Make sure that it is a regular brush. Check to actually make sure the softness of this brush. Now, this is going to be, shadows work different ways. We're going to look at the nature of shadows in greater depth next week because we're going to get into doing complex and compound shadowing next week. But for this week, we're just going to work with simple shadows. When you have something that is really close, a shadow that's extremely close to whatever casting the shadow, the edges tend to be very sharp. If you have something that's actually casting a shadow, but really far away from what it's casting a shadow on, it tends to be very soft. So again, you're not going to see this on the video, but you can see it on this. You'll hear it on the video, and hopefully remember this. If I take my hand right here and I cast a shadow on this background, you can see it's actually very soft. It's a very light shadow, and it's really fuzzy. It's really soft around the edges. It's really fuzzy. It's not that discriminating. But as I get closer and closer to this, my shadow gets darker, and it also gets sharper. And when I come in here really tight like this, it gets really sharp and really dark. So you need to consider what it is that is casting your shadow and in proximity to the background. So the shadow that would be caused by her feet on this thing, on these rocks, would be relatively dark and very sharp. And so that's what I'm going to try to paint. So again, I'm going to hit the B key to do this. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller. Make sure that your blending mode is normal, 100% opacity, 100% flow. Make sure black is your foreground color. And the beauty of having this underneath your figure is I'm actually going to use this to paint right underneath her shoe, but I'm going to actually, if you want to do the same rough size that I've got a brush that's 60 pixels. You can be somewhat close to this. But I'm actually going to paint this on top of her shoe with only a small edge of the shadow of the brush underneath her shoe. The shadow that I'm painting will actually be underneath her shoe, but on top of the rocks. So if you simply click and drag across, you'll actually see that that's indeed what actually happens here. And I can come back here and try to actually engineer the shadow that I think would actually be caused by her shoe right here. Now there's probably also some that's actually being caused by, that's underneath the rest of her foot that's right here. So I'm going to kick this part back a little bit to make sure that it's sort of like under like that. Then I'm going to zoom back out. And actually, I went too far with that because it wouldn't go all the way up and fill up her shoe like that. It would simply go, I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller and continue sort of back like this. That's basically, again, what you would consider possibly some shadow to look like. But again, this is not my forte. I'm just admitting that to you right now. Now, this shadow's too dark, so I'm simply going to take the opacity slider and drop it down so that I've actually got what would be considered sort of a transparency somewhere, sort of like shadow in there. I'm going to double click on the hand to kick back out and actually do the same thing under her other foot. So again, B key and simply paint a shadow that's actually underneath this part. Double click on the hand, and now you can actually see again, if we turn the shadow on and off, in one case she's actually anchored to this background, in the other case she's not anchored to the background. My opacity is still a little bit high on this, so I'm going to drop it down a little bit more to make it a little bit more believable. And again, she's much more anchored into the field right now. Probably build a little bit more shadow underneath her foot. So that's one way of doing it, but for me, it's again, this is just not my forte. So I'm going to show you a way that I think is much better for actually building shadows. It makes them much more believable. This is the way I build the majority of my shadows if they're not complex ones. So I'm simply going to turn this layer off. I'm not going to get rid of it so we can go back and compare it later on. And I'm going to add another blank layer on top of this. So this is where I'm going to actually start my different version of building shadows. So to do this, it involves the gradient tool and the eraser. And those two, if you just think of gradient tool, the G key, and eraser tool, the E key, it will allow you to do this work much, much, much faster. So if you hit the G key or simply go, it's in the gradient tool is in the middle of your toolbar. Occasionally, it's got a counterpart to it, although in my case, mine doesn't. Does yours have a second option if you click on the gradient tool? Does it have a little down arrow? The paint bucket is usually with it. Just make sure you've got the gradient tool and not the paint bucket, because the paint bucket is worthless if you want to know the truth. So at any rate, make sure you have the gradient tool. When you have the gradient tool, you need to actually look up at the top of your options palette here. Again, setting these is critical to how this part works. So the first thing is there's a swatch patch that's up at the top that shows you the gradient. By default, usually, but again, the gradient tool can be sticky, so it's not always this case, but usually it shows you foreground to background color. In our case, again, foreground is black, background is white, and this is black to white. However, if you click on the little arrow next to that, you will get a drop-down menu that has a series of folders in it that are different styles of gradients. If you stick with the basics, which is what we're going to do, open the basics up, you will see there's 3 of them in the basics panel. The first one, if you hover over it, is actually foreground. Does everybody have this? Okay. The first one is foreground to background. The second one, if you hover over it, is foreground to transparent, which is what we are looking for. So I want you to click on that. Now, if white is your foreground color, you simply need to hit the X key to make black your foreground color. We need to go from black to transparent. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So again, if you're, you can, let me see here if you can actually change the color. Yeah, your X key will not work as long as you've got this menu open like this. To get rid of the flyout menu, again, simply click on a blank spot of your options palette, and then you can actually hit the X key. That would be white to transparent, but you want to make sure you've got black to transparent. That's what we actually want in here. Then next to this, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, there are 5 different styles of gradient. To show you what they are, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and turn off the eyeball for the figure that's on the green screen and also for the trees so that you can actually see what these gradients look like. The first gradient, so again, I'm now at the little baby icons that are running to the right of the swatch palette that was foreground to background. The first one is a linear gradient. So if you click and you drag all the way across, you'll see, actually here, let's do this. I'm going to hit Command-Z to undo that. Let's change our gradient from, again, I've just clicked on the swatch again. I want to go back to the very first one that's foreground to background. It's easier to see what these things look like if we do it that way. So then, again, I'm going to click on this very first icon, which is a linear gradient. If you come over and click on the left side of your image, drag to the right side of your image, hold down the Shift key. The Shift key will constrain this to being perfectly horizontal, and let go. You will actually get your foreground color, which is black, to your background, to the background color, which is white. If you hit Command-Z to undo that and go to the next gradient, the little icons that are at the very top, I'm going to go to the second one. The second one is a radial gradient. If you now click in the middle of your image and drag to one side, you will see that it actually does a circle that's going from foreground color to background color. So it's a circular gradient. Command Z to undo that. The next one over, these are supposed to be perspective gradients. So I'm going to the third one over now. I'm also going to click in the middle and drag to the side. This is actually supposed to be the idea. What you would get is if you were looking inside of a cone. I mean, that's basically what this, but it's also subjective to the lighting on all of this part. I don't ever really think it looks like that, but that's just me. I actually think the final gradient on this is closer to that, but nonetheless, that's what this is supposed to be. Command Z to undo that. The fourth little icon over is a reflected gradient. To do this, I don't want you to pull left and right. I want you to actually pull sort of top to bottom. So I'm going to grab somewhere, I'm going to click somewhere down from the top, and I'm going to drag straight down and let go. And actually, let's do this. Command Z to undo that. Do it from the very middle and drag down. And you'll see that what you end up here is that you end up with foreground to background on the bottom, and then the mirror reflection of that, foreground to background on the top. So this is called a reflected gradient. Hit Command Z to undo that. And then finally, the last one over is the one that I think looks actually more like a cone. So I'm going to click in the middle and drag over again. It's supposed to be the illusion that you would get, not in a cone, but the illusion that you would have if, let's say, you were inside of a church that had a steeple that had 4 sides to it, and that were like you were just looking up. It's supposed to be receding into space. I have no idea what the name of this gradient is, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. And then finally, we're going to set this up to build your shadows. So to do this, you change again, go to the swatch gradient and change this from foreground to transparent. And then also make this a radial gradient. So click on the second of the little icons over. And now what we're going to do is this. I'm going to show it to you, and then we'll actually apply it in person right here. I'm going to simply, in any space, it doesn't matter where you are in your image, just I'm sort of in the middle area of my image. I'm going to click and drag down, and I get a radial gradient that's going from black to transparent. However, now that I've actually got this thing, I'm going to transform it. Hit Command T to actually transform this. And you'll get little control lines that are around your gradient. Now, if you actually click on the control handle that's at the very top and you bring it down, you will see that you start to crush the gradient, but you're crushing it from the top down. You're not crushing it equally, which is what we really want to do. So hit Command Z to undo that. This time, add the Option key when you click on this. So hold down your Option key, click on that same handle on the top, and now when you drag it down, you'll see that it actually does the mirror image. It crushes your gradient from the top down and from the bottom up. You can do the exact same thing in the width of this guy. You can actually get onto the control handles that are on the side over here. I'm starting on the right side. Hold down the Option key. And now when you click and you drag in, it will compress your gradient in this gradient starting on both edges, so that it's all symmetrical. If you hover your cursor on the outside of those control handles, you'll get the double-headed arrow that shows you that you can rotate this. So I can actually rotate this shadow. I can actually make it completely up and down. You can actually maneuver the shadow to be any sort of like orientation that you actually want. If you click, and this is a tricky one, if you click inside the bounding box, do not click on the little anchor point. If you click on the anchor point and then try to move the gradient, it won't move the gradient, it'll move the anchor point, which will then affect how all of your control handles work. Instead, I'm going to click, look at my screen really quickly, I'm going to click in this area that's in between all the control handles. I can click and I can now move my gradient around, and I can continue to rotate it, and I can continue to scale only part of it if I want to. I can make it a little bit narrower. I can add my Option keys to get it symmetrical, but you can really modify this gradient. Make sense to everyone what's going on? All right, I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel to this, so I'm not going to actually do that, and I'm going to throw this entire layer away. I'm going to turn on the figure. I'm going to turn on the trees. I'm going to then add a new blank layer to actually start doing this gradient work for my shadows. So I'm going to add, simply, again, click on the icon at the very bottom next to the garbage can. It puts on a brand new layer. I'm going to double click on it and call it Shadow 1. And say OK. And then I'm going to zoom in to her feet. I'm going to start again with the boot that's on the, just on the rocks over here. And again, because I am working on a layer underneath the figure, this will not land on top of the figure. So I'm simply going to click and drag out a gradient. It doesn't really matter what size it is. This is, again, it's going from black to transparent. Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. Hold down the Option and compress this from both sides. I'm going to click on this now and drag it down underneath her boot. I'm going to rotate this slightly so that it more matches what the area that's actually underneath her shoe. And in this case, I'm actually lined up pretty good. My front is coming a little too forward for me, but I'm not going to worry about that part a little too much. I'm going to go ahead and leave the front coming in front of her shoe. It'll be a little bit better for me to work with here because I'm going to show you the last part about this. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK to this. I'm going to click on the check mark or hit the Enter key, regardless of how you do it. This is actually now laid down our first layer of shadow. However, shadows would never be in front of her shoes. You can see in my area, this shadow is in front of her toe right here. That would never exist. There's lighting that's coming straight down on here. The shadow would only be underneath her shoes. So if everything else is correct, except for that, hit the E key. It brings up the eraser tool. In the eraser tool, just check to make sure your options are set. Again, the eraser tool is a brush. Click on the drop-down menu to make sure. I'm going to leave mine about a 50% hardness. It'll give me a little bit softer edge. That part's fine. Make sure that the mode is brush. I'm going to leave the opacity at 100%, and my flow I'm going to set at around 6% so that I can scrub away the shadow that's actually in the front. So I'm going to make my eraser a little bit larger, and then I'm simply going to erase the area that's actually right in front of her boot and also knock off a little bit on the bottom of that. I'm going to do the same thing in the back because the shadow went too far out. The shadow's actually hitting part of I like it on the rock, like this area right here. I like it on the rock right in here, but I don't like it on the rock that's in the back. The shadow would never be back there. So I'm simply going to hit an eraser line back there and probably knock that part off a little bit more. So compound shadows tend to be made up, or not compound shadows, but shadows like this, you need to realize that the area that in the back would be a little bit lighter than the area that's right underneath her toe. That would actually be a little bit darker. So to fix that, we actually do the same process again, and we add another shadow to this. This is why this tool works, or this method, I think works so well, is you can build really complex shadow shapes. Anyway, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to add another blank layer. Do not try to do this on the same layer. All of these shadows should be on a unique layer because then you can go back and control the opacity of each one of them individually. If you gang them all together, then the shadow that we make right now, which should be darker, would be the same if I use opacity to control it. So I'm going to add another blank layer. I'm going to call this Shadow 2. Again, the G key to get the gradient tool, click and drag out a gradient. It doesn't need to be quite as big because it's only going to go up underneath the front part of her foot. Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. Hold down the Option key and collapse this shadow. I'm also going to make it much narrower. I mean, not as wide. I guess that would be narrower. Again, I'm really looking for something just to put right in front of her toe. I'm going to rotate this a little bit, and then I'm going to click and drag and bring this right in front of her toe so that it's actually considerably darker underneath it. Now, at this stage of the game, it's the control handles and the anchor point and all of that kind of stuff here are like making this really difficult to see the shadow. Remember, Command H will hide all the extras in Photoshop. So if you hit Command H, they will go away, but they are still there. If you hover your cursor in here, you can actually see, you can still move it around, you can still rotate it a little bit, you can do all of those sorts of things. So for me, at this stage of the game, this is a far more convincing shadow, so I'm going to go ahead again and click on the check mark to actually put that into place. I'm going to double click on the hand, and you can actually see what sort of shadow we've actually built now underneath this shoe. We'll go ahead and do the other ones really quickly just so that you get a little practice doing this. I'm going to add one more shadow to this, shadow number 3, just another blank layer. I'm going to zoom into her other foot. Hit the G key to get the gradient tool, click and drag down. Hit the Command T to actually transform this. Hold down the Option key to crush it. I mean, again, we are just doing the exact same thing that we've been doing over and over and over again. I'm going to bring it under her right foot. In this case, I'm not going to make it a little bit narrower. It's too wide. It's actually going out too wide from her feet, but I like what it's doing underneath her feet. So I'm going to go ahead and accept this. Just click on the check mark to say OK to that. Hit the E key to get the eraser tool and get rid of the shadow that's on both sides of her feet. Because again, there's nothing that explains shadow on both sides of her feet. There would be nothing that would actually do that part. So this one is actually, now this is what my shadow number 3 is actually doing. And I'm going to double click on the hand. And again, you can refine these a lot more. I've still got this shadow that's underneath her foot. It looks like it's coming down a little bit too much for me, I think. Let me see what's really going on here. No, it just needs to be cleaned up with a little bit more of an eraser. You can actually transform these again, even though I've erased this. Command T again will bring up the transform dialog box again, and we can actually then go ahead and refine this a little bit better. And that looks better to me. Yeah, I've still got a little too much on one side, so the E key to bring up the eraser and just scrub away that part. Double click on the hand. So this is what this one looks like, and again, I would spend more time actually doing this, but to see the difference in the two, I'm going to click on the history snapshot and just say OK to snapshot number 1. This is the one that's actually got the gradients that are on it. I'm going to then turn the gradients off and turn on just the layer number 1 where we hand painted those shadows that were underneath it. Yeah, just the one that's hand shadow that we painted underneath it. I'm going to go ahead and do another snapshot of that and then go up to the top of my history palette and go between 1 and 2. And you can see what a difference the whole gradient method actually makes in this. It's, in my opinion, far more convincing and far more believable. Questions about this? Alrighty. Hit the F key to get back to the black pasteboard. F key one more time to get back to the little 3 stoplights, and you can close this image up. You do not need to save this guy. We're going to try to get through perspective. I know this is a lot today. I'm not going to lie to you. This is a lot today, but the reason I'm giving you this is that we are going to spend the next 3 weeks working on compositing. And I'm trying to plant all the seeds here in the beginning so that you can refer back to this. Pretty much everything I'm going to show you in here from this point on, I'm not going to make that promise. Anyway, okay. Next thing, we are going to go back into your student week 9 folder. And there's a folder in there called Perspective. And if you click on that, and take a look up at the very top. There's 4 files in here. There is a PDF in here about perspective, transforming in perspective. That will be a part of what we look at and talk about right now. But this first part that I want to get through with you guys is just a basic understanding of perspective. So when I talk about perspective, a lot of people, you know, you're familiar with the word, but maybe not familiar with the concept and how it really works. And so that's what we're going to actually deal with right now. Most of what we're going to deal with right now are simply things to keep in mind when you're actually doing your compositing work. Anyway, we're going to start. So the file that I want you to open up is the one that's at the very top, this 01-01. This actually comes from a guy, again, I have a few online places that I actually go to. Sadly, one of them is no longer online. You guys who were here last week saw when I tried to go to Mindful Retouch. The girl who actually wrote it and published it is Russian, and they've shut her down. So she's no longer, so you can't get to that website anymore. But at any rate, the people that are online doing Photoshop work that I respect and the people that I actually learn from a lot, there's 3 people that actually come to mind. The So if you're into doing this kind of stuff, if you're that Photoshop kind of person, whatever, these are people that you should be spending your time with. There's a lot of junk that's out there, but these people are actually really, really, really good. The first person that I would suggest that you go to, well, it's a toss-up. I'll just give credit here because it's the guy who built this file. There's a guy who's, his name is Jesus Ramirez. He runs a website called the Photoshop Training Channel, PTC. Man is absolutely brilliant. He does a lot of 3D work as well. So if you're into doing 3D work, he's another person to follow there. Photoshop is pretty much removing all of the 3D things that you can do in Photoshop. They've got a completely new dedicated program to doing 3D work. It's unfortunate because there was a little bit of 3D work that we could use in Photoshop, but Photoshop is committed to getting rid of all of it. So does anybody in this class ever use lighting effects in Photoshop? It was all based on 3D technology, and unfortunately the tools still exist in there, but it doesn't work because they are getting rid of it. But at any rate, Jesus Ramirez, Photoshop Training Channel is the first one. The second person, and the person I probably spend more time looking at, actually, the guy that I would consider to really sort of be the best person to go to, is a guy who runs a website called Pix Imperfect. And I can never say his name, so I'm just going to go there really quickly. So we can go back. This is his name right here. Yamish Dinda. Anyway, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant guy. We're actually going to look. The reason I'm giving these guys credit as well is that we're going to be working with both of their images today. The first one we're looking at right now is Jesus Ramirez. We're going to do one later on that actually comes from Pix Imperfect. So anyway, shout out where it's actually due. And the last one is, I'm not going to remember right now. I'm not going to wait, but I will remember during the break, and I will actually tell you the third one that I actually look at. So at any rate, back to Photoshop with this image open. So with this image open, what this is so again, this is Jesus Ramirez. He's created this. The initial part of this is in a three-dimensional space. So if what you're looking at here is a ground plane that actually goes back to a horizon line with the sky above it. Does that make sense to sort of the illustration that you get of this? Okay, and the first thing that I want you to actually look at is on your layers palette over here. This can get a little confusing because there's a lot of layers in here. But I want you to select on the green group that's called People. And then if you'll click on it, I'll take that back. Let's do the very first one, not the very first one, the center image, the red one, the one that says Diagrams. So it's the group that's tagged in red. Make it active. Click it open, and you will actually see that there is bunch of layers in here. I'm going to drag my layers palette out so that you can see this a little bit better and you can see all the names that are actually in it. So the first thing that we're actually going to do here is once you get that diagram to open up, you should see there's a group in here called One Perspective, and its eyeball is turned off. I want you to turn it on. And what you should see is 3 cubes that are sitting on your screen. Does everybody have this part? Again, I'm going to go a little bit slower here because I want to make sure that everybody... So if all of a sudden something is not working for you, give me a shout out so that we can stop so you can actually see this part. These 3 cubes are in perspective. Now, they look like it. If this was an illustration, it looks like, okay, yeah, that fits. The 2 cubes that are on the ground plane, one's a little bit closer to us, one's a little bit further away, and then there's a cube that's actually floating up in the air. But they appear to be, this is a single point perspective, and what we mean by that is if you look at the converging lines created by these square shapes, they will actually all converge to the same one single point. It's an infinity point that actually lands on the horizon line. To see that, scroll down on your inside this group on your layers palette, and what you're looking for is underneath all of this, you will see another group that's called Vanishing Point. And if you click on that, it actually will show you the converging lines. They're sitting right here in green. So what they're doing is that they are taking, again, this line right here. They're just putting like a ruler on this line and drawing an extension all the way back and doing the same thing off of this other side and a third one off of this side. They will all eventually converge on the same single one point. If you guys are familiar with The Last Supper, this is what Da Vinci used to actually do that painting, is again single point perspective. These do all converge on a single point. This is actually called the vanishing point, and this vanishing point also happens on what we call the horizon line. If you click right on the group underneath the vanishing point that's called horizon line, you'll actually see it's just showing you that darker that place in a darker area. The horizon line is always where ground plane meets sky. Now, the horizon line can change in your image depending on where you are. So if you are very low in your image and you're looking at the horizon point, it will happen in one place in your image. If you go up very high and you look down at the horizon line, it will show at a different point of your image. The higher you up, the higher you are up and looking down, the higher the vanishing point actually is in your scene. The lower you are down, not just the vanishing point, but the horizon line, the lower you are down, the lower the horizon line is and the vanishing point is as well. Does this make sense to everybody what's going on here? Okay. There's a group in the middle called Free Cube. I want you to actually click on Free Cube. Another image shows up and you can see that this guy is actually still in perspective. Underneath Free Cube, you can actually turn on its vanishing point lines as well. And you can see it's the same thing. Now, in this case, it's not landing in exactly the same spot as this other one. But that's not the question here. That's not the issue here. The issue is that the vanishing point is landing on the horizon line. It's simply over. If we pulled this back into the center of this image, they too would all go back to this one single point. So I'm going to ask you to turn off the vanishing point cube, the free one, the lines that we just added. I'm going to ask you to take those off. I'm going to also ask you to select the Free Cube group. So I've just selected the Free Cube group. I'm going to hit the V key to get the Move tool, and I'm simply going to raise the cube up. And look at this. Does this look right? Now, you may not know exactly what's going on, but when you look at this, everybody seems grounded and in place, but this guy does not. This guy, there's something weird going on. And this is the thing about perspective. When you are doing your compositing work and you're looking at your composite and you're saying to yourself, okay, this should be right, but there's something wrong. I don't know what it is. 9 times out of 10, it is perspective. And here the perspective is off. If you turn on the vanishing point for the Free Cube, you will see that the vanishing point lines are not landing, the converging lines are not landing at the vanishing point, which is on the horizon line. They are sitting above it. And that's why this thing does not make sense. That's why it does not look correct. Are we good on this part? Making sense? Okay, you can go up to the group at the very top where we had 1 point perspective, and you can turn the eyeball off. You can collapse that group, and now we're going to look at 2 point perspective. So simply click on the eyeball for 2 point perspective. You can also open the group for 2 point perspective. We've got 3 cubes that are actually in here right now. And the thing about these 3 cubes that are important to realize is that they have 2 faces now that will actually create converging lines that will also land on the horizon line. To see those vanishing points, simply click on the eyeball that's underneath it, and you will see we have 2 sets of converging points. The way you can think about this, I'm going to do the one that's actually in the very middle, but it applies to all of them. But the one that's actually in the middle, imagine this is a building that you're looking at the corner of a building, and you see one face of the building going in one direction and the other face going in. So like this part right here is the front of the building, and this is the side of the building. That's when you get 2 point perspective. In those cases, their converging lines, if this thing is in perspective, will also converge to the vanishing point, and those vanishing points will also land on the horizon line. With 2-point perspective, if your horizon line is not perfectly level, which can happen if you just tilt your camera, if you cock your camera, we call it dutching your camera, if you twist it a little bit one side up or one side down, the double vanishing points will establish where that horizon line is. So again, we've still got the same horizon line that's running right along this. Does this make sense to everybody, what's going on here? Again, there's a horizon line here. It's just showing you that this is where this guy exists. We can actually then turn off the eyeball for a 2-point perspective and collapse it, and then go to 3-point perspective. It's the last one down. If you actually click on this and open it up, so this would be an image, if you imagine we're in space and this building is floating up above the horizon. It's just sort of like floating in the air. This is a 3-point perspective. If you actually open up the 3-point perspective group, you can actually turn on its vanishing lines. And what you see that happens with 3-point perspective is you have 2 sets of converging lines that will establish the vanishing point and the horizon line, and then you have one that's simply out into space. And it doesn't, this is just ultimately 3-point perspective. So what we're seeing here is 2 faces, this face right here and this face right here, and then the 3rd-point perspective is actually this part right here. The thing that looks like what would be the base of our building. So if we call this a building, or call it just a square that's floating up into space, some sculpture or something like that, again, this would be 3-point perspective. If you come up to your image menu and come down to image rotation and flip this thing, so I'm going to flip my entire canvas vertically. Now just try to imagine that what's above here is the sky. Imagine this gradient is now my ground plane and this is the sky. What is happening here is that this would be what you would see if you were in a helicopter looking down on the top of a building. You would still have a 3-point perspective. So this would be 2 faces of the building, and this would actually be the rooftop of the building. Again, those vanishing, you'll see because I'm much higher in the air, my horizon line is also much higher. Again, but the vanishing point and converging lines do not change in this regard at all. Does that make sense to everyone? Turn off the 3 eyeball for 3-point perspective. We are actually going to rotate the image back again. So simply go back to your history palette and go back before you said flip horizontal, flip vertical. And then again, turn off the 3-point perspective group. You can collapse that. The last one down in this group, or the red group right here, is the top to bottom boxes. And I'm going to turn its eyeball on, and I'm going to open it up. And you will actually see, once we get this open, this is one of the ways that you know if things are out of perspective or not. If you are a person who draws or paints, you would already know this stuff. If you're not a person, if you're a photographer like me, art is more of a challenge. But what you'll see here is happening is this. The boxes that are below the horizon line, you can actually see the top of the box. As you start to move up and you get closer to the horizon line, you start to lose the top edge of the box. The minute you go above the horizon line, you can no longer see any of the top of the box. You actually start seeing the bottom of the box. And as it gets higher, the boxes get higher and higher and higher, you see more and more and more of the bottom of the box if these things are in perspective. Does that make sense? This is going to help. Will you please, everybody, do this, because you need to move this car around. I want you to actually then click on the car to make it visible. Is this car in perspective? How do you know? Is that, well, cars can float in the air. Fuck, haven't you seen Back to the Future? And, you know, everybody now is trying to come up with a flying car. That's not what it's got to do with it. Why do I know that this is not in perspective? Exactly. I can see the top of the car, but it is above the horizon line. I should be looking at the bottom of the car and not be able to see the top. Now, I'm not going to see only the bottom. It's going to be very much like this part right here. But I can see this top of the car right here. I can see that, and I should not be able to do that if this was in perspective. So select the car layer, hit the V key, and then simply pull this car down and watch what happens. The minute you drop it right below the perspective line, right below the horizon line, the car anchors into the image, it's in space, and it's because it is now in perspective. This again, you can't believe how important this whole thing is. This is where a lot of composites go south. Does this part make sense to everyone? All right, so let's do this. We've got a little bit more. This is a lot. Let's do this. Let's do this. This is a good time for a break. We've gotten through a lot today already. We're halfway through this part. So why don't we do a quick break? I've got 10 till if you guys make this a hard back 5 minutes after. And did everybody get on the sign-in sheet? And where is the sign-in sheet? It's right there. So if you're not on it, please get on it.